Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, I'm glad we've had this opportunity to debate this matter today. It's been a long time coming. And, Mr Speaker, I think this is an issue which, in the short time that they've had it available to them, the media have had a chance to look at this report from the Auditor-General. And I think the headline that I've got in front of me pretty much sums it up. It says, "Shortcomings but no corruption in sheep deal," from the Auditor-General. Mr Speaker, that behoves us to ask the question, what is corruption? We've heard, the Minister has said, and members have made comment, that it is corruption is something that, in this case, if it went to court legally, the people who have the finger pointed at them would probably get off. But it goes beyond that, because if they are significant shortcomings, and if an issue like this doesn't pass the public interest test, if it doesn't pass the will this make the front page of the Dominion Post test, if it's corruption of thought, if it's corruption of behaviour, if it's corruption of morals, if it's corruption of the established ethical ways of doing business, is that still corruption, Mr Speaker, and is it something that we want to countenance? Is it something that we want to allow this nation and this government to simply get away with, because that's a way of effectively covering something up? There's an awful lot that's been said in a very short hurry about this, Mr Speaker, and I think many of us probably haven't had a great deal of time to digest it in detail. But when there are statements that are made by someone of such unimpeachable integrity as the Auditor-General, when that person says, "I was surprised that it was decided to use a contract with a private individual's business interests to resolve a diplomatic issue between governments," that's something that we have to take on board and we have to take very seriously. Because in the grand scheme of things, resolving diplomatic issues between governments is not something that's done, on the face of it, by the payment of money between governments and private business individuals. When we boil all this down to brass tacks, essentially that's what that comes down to, Mr Speaker. What this government wanted was a free trade deal with the Gulf Cooperation Council, and what was standing in the way of it was a Saudi businessman who was annoyed, understandably perhaps from his point of view, at losing lots and lots of money from the ending of the live sheep trade, the live animal trade from New Zealand, which we as a sovereign nation put a stop to on ethical grounds because of the conditions faced by livestock as they are transported from this side of the world to the other. That all came about when something like 5,000 sheep died on a ship on the way from Australia to the Middle East. And fingers can be pointed in all sorts of directions as to who or what was ultimately to blame for that. But it threw a spotlight on a trade where thousands, tens of thousands of animals were being transported from what we like to think of as being civilised places for slaughter to places that are quite frequently accused of being uncivilised places for slaughter. And the conditions in which they were transported gave measure to that lack of civilisation. Never mind what happened at the other end when they arrived. We put a stop to it, money was lost, and people obviously at the other end of that deal were experiencing much chagrin about losing money and brought political and financial influence to bear on the political system at their end of the matter, and there we came to an impasse. So in order to break this impasse, a deal was reached, and a deal that many of us would regard as being ethically and in terms of business morals, corrupt. That involved, as it says on one of these many pieces of paper I have in front of me. Thank you very much. Involved the payment of something like $11 million worth of cash, livestock and agricultural equipment to a Saudi livestock importer. And that, we are told, supposedly broke the impasse. But, Mr Speaker, I have to call that into question too, because are we, in fact, any closer to resolving this deal that was brought to a halt by the end of our live sheep exports? Or are we still going to have, at the end of the day, to turn around and effectively bend over and lift our prohibition, because it's not a prohibition in law, it's not a ban in law. When the Animal Welfare Act was re-examined a couple of years ago by this House, Mr Speaker, we did not enshrine the ban on live animal exports other than for the likes of bloodstock. We relied on the convention that had been established since the prohibition was put in place. It is still legally possible for us to export livestock to that part of the world. Do we rely on that? Or are we going to see the resumption of shipments of live animals from this country to parts of the world who do not have the same ethical standards that we do in terms of their treatment of animals, in terms of the operation of their abattoirs, in terms of the way animals are slaughtered, in terms of the way animals are treated? Have we essentially sold our soul for the paltry sum of $11 million to placate one individual, $11 million, Mr Seymour, in the scheme of New Zealand's sheep exports, our meat exports overall, this economy in total? Yes, $11 million is a paltry sum. It's a paltry sum, Mr Seymour, and I think you really should take that on board because Mr Seymour, some things are actually more important than bottom lines, and some things are more important than paying lip service to concepts such as ethical behaviour. Sometimes corruption is corruption, even if, Mr Seymour, even if it is something that would not lead to a conviction in the court of law. If it's immoral, if it's unethical, if it's business practice that we as a nation do not want to be associated with, then it's a very paltry sum for selling our soul, Mr Seymour. The report goes on to say it is not clear on what basis the amounts paid to the Saudi Arabian investors' company under the contract were arrived at. So there is a complete lack of transparency, Mr Speaker, throughout this entire matter, and there has been from the beginning. And New Zealand First was saying so a long time ago. Back in May of 2015, we said that the deal was a new low in New Zealand diplomacy, a disgrace, borders on bribery, said our leader, the member for Northland, the Right Honourable Winston Peters. And New Zealand has been successfully blackmailed by two highly connected Saudi businessmen who have said, pay up or else your free trade deal is sunk. We are paying for their business decisions. Mr Speaker, it opens up a Pandora's box of potential claims, bearing in mind agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership now being negotiated. If this is something that the Auditor-General can discover in looking into one single deal like this, what on earth are we going to find when we eventually get to the behind-the-scenes negotiations that went on for the TPPA, which, depending on the outcome of the US election, may or may not happen, and that may be a very good thing, Mr Speaker. Going back to before the 2008 general election, which is slightly after this matter came to a head, we still haven't been told what promises were made by senior National Party figures to George Asaf of Wasi Limited, and especially the Saudi Minister of Agriculture, who visited Mr Asaf's Hawke's Bay farm on July 16th of that year. There is so much that is left unanswered, Mr Speaker, by this report and by the questions that have arisen as a result of this report, that almost we're at a point where, although we have to accept the findings of the Auditor-General because we don't call the integrity of the Auditor-General into question, I think that office has demonstrated over the years that it is above impeachment in that regard. It is quite likely that we are probably going to have a full commission of inquiry into this entire matter, Mr Speaker, because it is rotten to the core. That is obvious to everyone. It's obvious to the average person. It should be obvious to every member in this House, and it is going to be obvious to the public, and they're going to be asking those questions, and they deserve to have those questions answered, Mr Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable